Hello and welcome to Pellicar. This is Nuts and Bolts, episode 4. This is the show where we talk about the inner workings of Dresden's tale. I'm your host, Lewis Nichols. On past shows, we've talked about such exciting topics as a list of Velito, or levelable species, your elves, your minotaur, your humans, all that kind of stuff. We've had a little introduction to religion. Talked about Renia, the great healer. We've talked about the rite of strength. And we talked about some of the various titles and professions and some of the jargon that's common to the culture, stuff that's unique to Dresden's tale that you won't hear in other stories. So, I was trying to figure out what I was going to record today. And there's so many different subjects, and I don't really want to do too much because I want this to be responsive. And but I thought, I've only done 3 episodes, so I should do at least one more. So, I asked my buddy what I should do. There's one guy that always helps me out on these videos. So I asked Bart. Artemis, tell him what you told me. Tell him your idea. Alright, well, of course now he decides to get shy. So what Bart decided was that we should talk about history. And that's what we're going to do today. We are going to start with the beginning of the calendar. We're going to figure out what all that means years after the fall. And we're going to run right up to where we are today with the story. So, without further ado, here we go. Now, Moldav's history is murky, to say the least. The calendar goes back, over 2,000 years. The first 1,000 of that is a black hole. There's no information available, no written record. There's some architecture that, the sages think go back that far, but who built it and how it was built and, all that is a mystery. It's certainly possible that at some point there'll be archaeological discoveries or divinations that let people know, but for right now, there's just nothing. So that brings up 3 obvious points. The first 2 are old dwarves and old elves. So I should state, just so you know, there aren't any. Although they can live to be many hundreds of years old, they're not around. There was no population enough to support long-lived races, and quite frankly, things were just gloomy. You had medical issues, disease has been a problem for a very long time, and we're dealing with very small populations. Some of that will become more clear as we go on. The second is, what about very powerful creatures? Well, I guess the best way to put it is, they're not talking. So, starting around 1,000 years, we start to have some references. There are some literary texts that have survived, not necessarily from 1,000 years back, but probably from 600 to 700 years. And they do have some reports from people who were there to see things. A lot of what survived, it's hard to say whether it was done for literary purposes, for entertainment, or whether it was a true documentary. But it at least all gives us some idea of what was happening back then. So we know that during this time period, say 1,000 years after the fall to about 1,400 years after the fall, there were populations in Kodos, Tarikia, the Foot, and Patronsburg. These were the great powers of the time. We also know that they were all in a general decline. So why were they in a decline? Because at one point, presumably 2,000 years ago, mankind, the Velito, had pissed off the gods. Nobody knows exactly what happened, but it did happen. They were stripped of priestly magic, earthly magic. What magical items were around were stripped away. Man was left to fend for himself without benefit of magic and higher powers. But they were given a quest that if they could gather 101 magical stones, then they could perform a ceremony that would return them to the grace of the gods. These stones were scattered around through Moldav, and presumably over the years they started this quest. Now it's known from these old histories from 1,000 years ago and younger that often what happened, stones were recovered, great deeds were done by heroes, and then the politicians messed it up. There was bickering between the great powers. Stones were lost. Many stones were recovered over and over again over the centuries, only to be given up and lost again and again. By 1,800 years after the fall, Tarikia had collapsed entirely. The Gaelics had withdrawn and retreated to the city of Patronsburg, considered the most powerful place in Moldav right now at that moment. They were at war with Kodos at the time, and Kodos collapsed as well, disintegrating. So you ended up with humanity withdrawing into the walled city. At around 2,000 years after the fall, the last settlements in the Foot were no longer viable, and they migrated to Patronsburg. So by this time, the city was a mess. You essentially had 3 levels. It was a mountainous city. The upper levels was government buildings and the priesthood. There were 2 rulers in the city, the Pope as a religious figurehead, and there was a governor as well. The middle city was fairly clean, had services provided for the people who could afford it. The majority of people lived in the lower city, and it was all the usual kinds of awful that you can imagine, with no services and no law enforcement, people feeding, sometimes literally, on each other. There were always food shortages. There was disease. It was just generally a nasty place to live. And the quest continued. The city had decided that every year it would send out a fighting team, 12 new members that were chosen by destiny, by divination, that would go out and gather the stones. Now, at the time that the campaign that the story's based on started, no teams had come back for a few years, and things were as gloom and dismal as they could possibly be. In fact, the city was surrounded. There was a safe zone, more or less, if you can call it that, but trying to escape the city, there was a wide band that magically attracted beasts of various sorts, giant feral forms of animals, giant foxes, packs of wolves. There were trolls around, very, very vicious, very dangerous creatures. And it was difficult to get out. Many believed that it was the end of the Velito, the end of humanity. Out in the plains beyond the danger zone, you had a huge knoll population, the dog faces. Some believed, especially the Knolls, that they would be the next favored race, that they would one day attain Velito status. Among the cultured Knolls, you had a large population, just as large as you had in Patronsburg, in fact, of an enslaved humanity. Humans, Minotaur, the usual races that were enslaved under the fairly well organized and fairly well developed, for Knolls, kingdoms. In the mid 2030s, the questers, as those teams were called that went out every year, started to figure out that they were marching into oblivion. When they escaped the donut, as it was often called, the danger zone around Patronsburg, they were left out in the wilderness with no support, nowhere to go trade and sell or train. They were just completely on their own. So a few groups started to band together. They developed an old keep, Marvin's Point, and established it as a defensive point. They would do their best to intercept new groups coming down from Patronsburg, and they would bring them into the keep and offer them advice and encourage them not to go out too far from the keep in their first year of fighting. Let them get some slow experience, not just dive headlong into the dangers of the world. This went on for a couple years till there was a pretty strong force of warriors. And they decided that it was time to fight their way back into the city and drop off the stones that they had collected. Now, things immediately were tense. The combined groups of questers amounted to a pretty significant concentration of power. You had experienced warriors, of course, no magic, all sword, all fighters. But still, you had the same thing back in the city. And of course, they're welcomed as heroes, which they very definitely are. The governor embraced them. The popes, not so much. I should say that's popes, pope singular. You don't have multiple popes at the same time. So, with a little fussing, the questers were in town for a few days and then left to go back to Marvin's Point. Come to find out, several of them had snuck out, family members and loved ones and brothers and cousins, and back to Marvin's Point. Now, after that, they started to go back fairly regularly, not necessarily because they were gathering a lot of stones any more than usual, but because they wanted to improve their position at Marvin's Point by bringing in, simple men-at-arms, guardsmen, and a staff. I mean, people to cook and do the work. Even though the culture doesn't quite have this overdeveloped sense of the right of strength yet, it's still the theological basis there. So these increasingly powerful warriors very much wanted to be served, and they felt that they deserved it. And you also just have a general goodwill of wanting to bring people out of these horrible circumstances. The next big change occurred when the questers heard that the city of Patronsburg, that the popes, who were firmly in control now, wanted to trade some of the stones that they had for food with the gnolls. This was right at the end of the 2030s. The questers decided that they weren't going to let that happen. So they went in with a large force and they deposed the popes. They didn't exactly take over in the city. Instead, they brought out several thousand the first year to move into Marvin's Point. And then year after that, it didn't take long to completely evacuate the city. And the quest went on. It took a while. It took almost another decade to gather all the stones. In 2049, they successfully completed the stone ceremony and regained full privileges of magic and the will of the gods. Now, to be honest, by this time, there was already some magic starting to trickle back into the world. You could call it cheating if you want to, but the gods had opened things up a little bit. There were a few priests around, not many, and there was axioms, Ziblich around as well. Now, demographically, something that's happened to the population of the Kelds has it's been this kind of regular doubling every few years. You had the clans form out of a necessity. Each of the adventuring teams took it upon themselves to gather up a group of evacuees from Patronsburg and take responsibility. The Stone Clan took their numbers and went to the nearby ruined city of Parncilia and rebuilt there. The Black Flag clan moved to the north. The Campbells even farther north than that. The Kelds of Patronsburg, who stayed around Marvin's Point and in the southern areas, almost immediately fell into a much expected war with the gnolls. Often they were just raids to liberate the slaves, and that's where that first doubling occurred. There were about as many slaves of the gnolls as there were residents of Patronsburg. The second doubling came a few years later, as the Keld peoples started to violently expand. You had the Hessian states defeated. You had the city-state of Nerishist and on Balestrand collapse. You had the peoples of Vul, where the Campbells were beginning to expand and explore. You had the tribes on Julbex being fought and absorbed. You had the peoples of Manelia. A great deal of them actually were already Keld, but they quickly fell into the empire as well. So moving into the 2050s, you already have a situation where over half of the population of what we'll call the Keld Empire, they are not Moldav born. Now, the power certainly lies with those who are Moldav born. All the chiefs are former questers. All the high-level adventurers, the high priests, the stronger warriors, they're all Moldav born. The biggest clans are the Campbells, the Doomed, and the Stone Clan, all roughly with equal numbers. The Tornado Clan isn't too far behind that. And you have the Maraudin with a significant number as well. You also have other clans, of course, that are, you know, definitely a part of the world in significance. The Plague Clan, the Legends, the Mycene clan from based in Manelia is the first non-Moldav of the clans. The largest cities of the day, Marvin's Point, around 30,000. Parncilia, over 35,000. After that, you have a fairly large population on Odessa, in the city of Jingendale. We'll get into that eventually. The city of Pyrgos, which is the Tornado clan capital of Manelia. The Tornado clan decided that they'd give that plane a try. You have a lot of colonization and a lot of moving out. The Kelds were aware by this time that they were in an adversarial position with the two other primary peoples, kind of the planar system, locked into a situation where they were not all going to survive. Only one would reap the rewards of longevity, and the other two would eventually fade into non-existence. And that is where we are in the world that Dresden Fane lives in. I hope you've all enjoyed these insights. If you have, hit the like button. If you really have, then hit the subscribe button. You can come see me on Twitter. Follow me at Lewis Nichols. And you can do all the other stuff too. The buying the book on Amazon, or going to my Patreon page. There's a lot of ways that you can support me. Most of all, I appreciate that you have supported me by listening to this much of the video. So, as I've mentioned before, I think Nuts and Bolts is going to become more responsive to comments, so it may be a while for me before I record another episode. But for you, it's just going to be a few days. Probably about a week, depending upon exactly my publication schedule. This does mean it's very likely that any comments that you make on this video or previous videos will get a response pretty quick here. And I look forward to interacting with you guys on a week-to-week basis. So, that said, thank you all very much for stopping by, and everyone have an absolutely wonderful day.